And now, without further delay, I'd like to turn the event over to our host, LaDotta Taylor, REL Alliance Lead. LaDotta, please begin.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone to today's event. We're excited to have you join us and think that we have great information to share with you about student engagement. The agenda, you can see on the screen. We will cover an overview so that you understand what a REL is, and we'll talk about REL Appalachia's mission, and then we will jump right into the discussion on student engagement, have some time for question and answers at the end, do a wrap-up, and then ask you to please complete a survey so that we have an understanding of what was helpful to you and beneficial from this webinar. First off, a REL, if you are not familiar, is a regional education laboratory, and there are 10 of those across the country, and they are administered by the U.S. Department of Education Institute of Education Sciences. And a REL serves a designated region within the country, and we work with school districts, state departments of ed, and others to use data and research to improve academic outcomes for students. You see the map on your screen, and we represent REL Appalachia, which is the gray states, and you can see that that includes Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Virginia. The other RELs are designated there, and again, basically what we do is to provide resources and work with districts and schools to apply data and research into their classrooms and into the work that they're doing within their school districts. We conduct empirical research and analysis, and we bring evidence-based data and information to policymakers and practitioners. We do things like bridge events, we hold webinars like today, and we also hold workshops. So we believe that providing this information and bringing this evidence-based information to not only the policymakers, but especially the practitioners is extremely important in helping to increase educational attainment and student productivity in classrooms. You can see our website if you would like more information, and then also please follow us on Twitter at REL Appalachia. Next, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Jerry Johnson, an associate professor in the College of Education and Human Services at the University of North Florida with us. At the university, he coordinates the Educational Leadership Program and teaches courses in research methods, organizational leadership, and adult learning. He is a former high school English teacher, high school principal, and policy analyst for the Rural School and Community Trust. He has nearly 20 years of experience as an educator in research and has authored more than 50 publications. In addition to his work in the U.S., Dr. Johnson consults regularly with universities in the Middle East and Africa on leadership development and education reform initiatives. Our goals for today's webinar are to introduce you to the construct of student engagement, to increase your understanding of the research around student engagement and how it can be measured, and provide you with the best practices and tools that can increase student engagement in your school and classrooms. So without further delay, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Jerry Johnson.
Thank you, LaDotta. Well, let's first take a look at just developing kind of a shared understanding of what we mean by student engagement. If you read the research on engagement, you'll see some subtle distinctions in how the concept gets defined, but there are some key ideas that are consistent throughout that literature. A working, broad, conceptual sort of definition that's inclusive of those different perspectives is listed here, or presented here. That is, student engagement is a measure of the extent to which a student willingly participates in schooling activities. Researchers and theorists generally agree that engagement is best understood not as a single construct. It's rather a kind of an umbrella term for a lot of different types of participation and ways that students participate and don't participate in school and related activities. So engagement manifests in different ways, and so it can be measured and understood in different ways. And perhaps most importantly for practitioners, different strategies are appropriate for promoting different types of engagement. And so understanding engagement beyond a large comprehensive measure, but to drill deeper into the different types of engagement and different ways that students connect or don't connect to schooling activities is very valuable for identifying the kinds of strategies and interventions that are likely to be effective in working with students. So there's some consensus among researchers and theorists that there are 4 broad categories of student engagement listed here. Academic and behavioral engagement are fairly straightforward constructs that most of us are familiar with. And they're the kinds of things that we've long measured without really thinking of them as measures of engagement. Academic engagement is the extent to which a student participates in the academic work of schooling. So completing homework, attending class, doing class activities, participating in traditional kinds of learning activities in schooling. And behavioral engagement is a measure of, or it's concerned with decisions and actions that are not specifically academic, but they are behaviors that facilitate or constrain academic work. So coming to school on time, participating in extracurricular activities. Again, things that we can measure and have measured with traditional kinds of outcome data, like attendance or grades or discipline records. So the other 2 types of engagement, affective or emotional engagement and cognitive engagement, let me go back to those. Those are a little different, and they're things that we don't typically measure in schools. Affective engagement refers to the student's feelings of belongingness to his or her school or classroom or teacher. And then cognitive engagement is a measure of the student's level of investment in their learning. And it's closely related to the perceived relevance of what he or she is learning in their classroom and how that connects to their long-term goals or where they see themselves heading. We'll talk a little bit more about those when we talk about some of the instruments for measuring these. So what does research say, the existing research say about student engagement? Three pretty straightforward points here. First, engaged students do better in school. Students who feel connected and are engaged in what's happening in their academic and social life related to schooling exhibit higher attendance, higher academic achievement, fewer disciplinary incidents, et cetera, et cetera. So it's associated with good things that we want for students. The second consistent finding from this research literature is that student engagement is closely associated with general measures of well-being. So engaged students make better life choices. And finally, and this one is especially important for practitioners, I think, and that is student engagement levels can be effectively influenced through interventions. No doubt most of you are familiar with lots and lots of research that connects student performance with variables that we don't have control over or that we have a difficult time influencing. We've measured the relationship between poverty and achievement over and over and over again. That's not something that we can directly influence or do something about. Student engagement is a characteristic that students have, that we can measure, and that we can treat or do something about or exert some kind of influence over. So now we're going to do a quick poll. As I noted earlier, there's some considerable variation in how student engagement gets described in the research literature. So it can mean different things to different people. And understanding your own familiarity with the construct can help me and help us inform the breadth and depth of the conversation that we're having and where it's headed next. So we'd like you to please select the description here that best characterizes your school or district's experience with student engagement. First option is we have not discussed student engagement at all. Second option, we've discussed student engagement but have not participated in any kind of professional learning that was related to engagement, and we haven't measured engagement in any systematic way among our students. Third option, we've done professional learning related to student engagement, but we have not attempted to measure it among our students. Fourth, we've measured it, but have not participated in professional learning. And then finally, fifth, we have measured student engagement among our students, and we have participated in professional learning. So take a moment to select the best option there. Okay, we're going to move on, but we'll get a look at these results as soon as they're available. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a recently released IES report that reviewed and described 21 different instruments developed by researchers that are intended to measure student engagement. I'll give you an overview of the report and talk a bit about its content and how it can be used to help you in your work around understanding and promoting student engagement. So the stated purpose of the report is to describe these instruments. The report does not evaluate the instruments or recommend, but it provides pretty detailed information across relevant categories that provide the raw information for informed consumer choices on the part of people looking for an instrument to use. And we'll get into the specifics of that. But it's an objective description of the characteristics without recommending one over another. So the content and structure of the report, it includes definitions, instrument types, reviews the psychometric properties, or not in detail, but it provides information about whether information on the psychometric properties are available. So what kind of work has been done to establish the validity and reliability of a particular instrument, to kind of give you the report doesn't give you a stamp of approval for how valid or reliable the instrument does, but it lets you know whether that information is available and where you can find it. It includes an abstract for each of the instruments, and it includes tables that allow you to compare quickly and easily different attributes of the instruments, which is very helpful when you're deciding about making a selection decision for an instrument that you might use in your school or for a research project. Some potential uses for stakeholders. The report can introduce stakeholders to the instruments that are available, give you a sense of what's out there, and provide information for how to access these instruments. It can also, as I mentioned earlier, by providing all of this objective information about the instruments, it can assist stakeholders in determining the appropriateness of the different measures that are available. So it's sort of a catalog. Here's a link to the report. So how is student engagement measured through these instruments, these 21 instruments included in the report? There's three primary ways three primary strategies for collecting data. among these 21 instruments, there are student self-report instruments. There are teacher reports where teachers answer questions to characterize the level of engagement for students. And then there are observational measures, protocols that can be used to spend time in a classroom, observe students, and make reasoned assessments, systematic assessments about the level and types of engagement that are evident in what's being observed. 3 dimensions of engagement are assessed via these 21 instruments. You'll recall earlier I mentioned there are 4 primary dimensions of engagement that are described in the literature. There are no instruments described in the report that measure academic engagement, because academic engagement is typically measured using traditional outcome data like student achievement results, so letter grades, scores on tests, that sort of thing. But the other 3 dimensions of engagement are all represented among these 21 instruments. So again, behavioral is a measure of the student's involvement in academic, social, and extracurricular activities associated with the school. Affective or emotional engagement is a measure of the extent to which the student, or extent of the student's positive and negative reactions to teachers, classmates, academics, and school. So a feeling of belongingness or a feeling of disconnection. And then the third dimension, cognitive, is a measure of the student's level of investment in his or her learning. And as we'll see when we start to take a look at the instruments that are available, some measure 1, some measure 2, some measure all 3. So what are the intended uses of these measures? The instruments are used for research purposes, research on student motivation, research on student cognition. They're used for research on dropping out. As we'll talk about a bit more in a minute, a primary way in which student engagement measures have been utilized by practitioners is for monitoring of student engagement for the purposes of dropout prevention and the purposes of identifying students in need of interventions and of targeting interventions to those students. These instruments have been used for the evaluation of interventions, doing impact studies to see whether a particular type of intervention is working to promote engagement or to reduce dropout. Instruments are also used for diagnosis and monitoring, and in 2 different ways. And this is an important distinction, because some of the instruments can be used for both of these types of diagnosis and monitoring, and some are only intended for use to do one or the other. But that diagnosis and monitoring can be used to generate understandings of the level of engagement at the classroom level, for a particular teacher, for a particular school, or even for a particular district. And so it can allow for needs assessments at these varying units of analysis. Instruments are also used, or have been used, if used effectively, for student level monitoring to track individual students and their level of engagement. Again, with the idea of both assessing need, identifying students who would benefit from some kind of intervention, and then also for targeting particular types of interventions that would be beneficial to a student based on what's learned from the measure. So we're going to highlight 3 measures from among these 21, and the 3 that I selected because they represent the 3 different types of student self-report instruments that are available. And I should say that the majority of the 21 instruments are student self-reports. So the 3 types, unidimensional, bidimensional, and multidimensional, again, represent whether the instrument is measuring a single dimension of engagement, two dimensions of engagement, or all three. Again, being affective, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral. All three of the instruments we selected have strong psychometric properties that are reported. So these are, they're good quality measures that someone should feel confident using. Each of these three are explicitly linked to the existing research on factors associated with student success. So these are measures that have been demonstrated to be associated with things that we would want for students. Academic success, post-secondary enrollment, high school completion, various kinds of outcome measures, but all outcome measures that we would generally think of as desirable. And so these are measures that help us understand something that we can be reasonably confident that if we measure it and it's there, then good outcomes for students are likely. And if it's not there, obviously, the opposite. So using these measures and finding low levels of engagement would we would expect to find undesirable outcomes or a lack of desirable outcomes. And each of these three instruments are designed for use in reporting school or district level results. So these are all the measures that, even though you're collecting it at the level of an individual student, they can be aggregated up to help us understand what's happening within a particular school or within a particular district. And so lends itself to mapping to the literature to find and select appropriate school-level interventions. So the first measure we'll highlight is the Identification with School Questionnaire, or the ISQ. It's a student self-report survey and was developed using a grade 8 sample. So it's primarily been used around middle school age kids. It measures one kind of engagement, that affective emotional engagement. So it's unidimensional. And so it's measuring that the student's feeling of connectedness to their school, teacher. It's designed for use with research on dropping out, for evaluation of class size interventions. If any of you are familiar with the STAR class size reduction research from several years ago, they used this as part of the line of inquiry that looked at whether the effects of that small class size extended beyond to later grades. And it's also been used to evaluate magnet school interventions. The logistics, it's 16 items and it takes about 15 minutes to complete. Of note, this is the information included here. This is the kind of information that you can get from those tables in the report. So with a quick look at a single page, you can sort of identify, okay, what's unidimensional, what's bidimensional, which one's a student self-report, which one's whatever, and so you can put together combinations of the things that speak to your interest and what you're trying to accomplish. The second measure is the Student Engagement Instrument, or the SEI. It's also a student self-report. It's designed and has been validated with grades 6 through 12. There are several published research studies that use the SEI. So there's a lot of good psychometric information about the instrument. There's also a lot of good information regarding interventions that have been used to try to affect or influence student engagement using this as the outcome measure. The designer of this instrument is Jim Appleton and various colleagues. He's the research and data chief for Gwinnett County, Georgia schools, and they make extensive use of this instrument for monitoring purposes and to inform policy and practice within the district to target interventions to students. So this is a bidimensional measure. It measures both emotional engagement and cognitive engagement, designed for use with research on dropping out, with evaluation dropout prevention programs, and with monitoring engagement levels at all the different levels. It can be used to monitor individual students, to monitor engagement at the level of the teacher, at the level of a classroom, at the level of a school, or the district level, and again for diagnosing individual needs and monitoring individual progress at the student level. 33 items, about 15 minutes to complete. And it really is written in a way that makes it accessible to 6th graders, but meaningful for 12th graders as well. Finally, the HSSE, the High School Survey of Student Engagement. This is a multidimensional, so it measures all 3 of the dimensions of engagement. It's also student self-report, and it's designed for grades 9 through 12. This one's used a lot. It's housed at Indiana University in the Center for Educational Evaluation and Policy, and is widely used. So lots of psychometric information about it. It's got a strong track record and a good instrument to use. It's designed for monitoring engagement levels at the teacher, school, or district level. It is not designed for use in monitoring individual students. This one's a little longer, as you would expect, since it's multidimensional. Has 121 items and takes about 30 minutes to complete. I should mention that the handouts that were included in the pre-event email included examples of these instruments and some additional information about them. So next we'll talk a bit about how these measures are used by practitioners, by school districts. A little bit of background first, though. Folks who study dropping out of school and student success this first phrase here is sort of a mantra among those researchers. The idea that dropping out of school is not an event but a process. So it's rare that a student is engaged and happy and feels a sense of belonging to his or her school, feels empowered with regard to his or her learning outcomes and where he or she is heading with regard to their academic life and their post-secondary school life, and then turns on a dime and drops out. That's exceedingly rare. And what those researchers tell us is that dropping out of school is best understood as this process that we can think of as a continuum. So at one end of the continuum, you have a fully engaged, successful student who, again, feels empowered about his or her learning. They feel connected to their school. They feel connected socially. They feel that their parents are supportive of their learning, all the kinds of things that we would want. At the other end of that continuum, we have a dropout. And researchers who study student engagement have made the case that engagement can be understood, or student engagement can be understood as a marker for where a student is on that continuum. As one marker, not the marker. It's not the continuum, but one way of understanding that. And so a key implication of that is the idea that if we have an appropriate understanding of the level of engagement of an individual student or of a group of students, and and we can use that to identify shifts. So a reduction in the level of engagement from a student. Imagine that the continuum goes 1 through 10. So 10 is fully engaged, and 1 is right on the verge of dropping out of school. If we adequately understand and understand in a clear, appropriate way what a student's level of engagement is, or what a school's level of aggregate engagement is, a shift from an 8 to 7 or an 8 to a 6 can allow us to intervene and provide supports and services and programs without waiting until the last minute. When we see a movement on that continuum, and when we're monitoring where students are on that, it allows us to identify needs and try to meet those needs without waiting until it's too late or very close to too late. And that's one of the things that the people who do research in this area feel very strongly about, especially the people who do research that focuses not just on measuring engagement, but on looking at school-based interventions and how effective those are. So that the key background here, understanding engagement as this continuum and as closely related to both student success and to dropping out. And so the applied use of student engagement measures by schools and school districts. Schools have used this to do needs assessment and targeting of interventions at all of these levels, classroom, school, district. This data can be used to identify, for instance, if there's an issue with engagement levels within a particular classroom. Or it may be at a particular grade level. For instance, at a transition grade, we might find that engagement looks relatively strong across the 5th, 6th, 7th grade, and then there's a shift to 8th grade for, say, an 8-12 high school, and we see a big dip, and we can match that dip in engagement up with the transition from a middle school to a high school setting, say. And so it's useful as a simple way of assessing needs at all these different levels. And it's also useful and has been used extensively by schools and school districts to assess needs and target interventions at the level of an individual student. I mentioned Jim Appleton's work at Gwinnett County. They've got a very sophisticated monitoring tool where they collect data on a regular basis from individual students, and it allows them in near real time to identify when there's some kind of significant change in the level of engagement for a particular student as evidenced by that student's response to a survey. And so the idea behind that kind of monitoring system is early identification of a need, early intervention, and not waiting until a student is close to dropping out before getting some services and some supports to the student. So I'll tell you a little bit about a project that we're doing at REL Appalachia right now, and then I think we'll have time for some questions. The project that we're doing at present, we're working with Kentucky and with West Virginia. I'll actually tell you about West Virginia first. West Virginia, the State Department of Education has developed a survey instrument of their own to measure student engagement. So they'll administer that instrument, and we will be assisting them by analyzing it. We'll first run some psychometric tests to see how well the survey is functioning to do what they want it to do. And then we'll do some analyses to help them understand what's going on in schools and districts with regard to student engagement as they've measured it. We'll prepare data memos for each school and district. And then we'll conduct a debriefing workshop where we help policymakers and practitioners to understand what we learned from the survey and what they can reasonably conclude and what they can't reasonably conclude about those results. We'll help them map the results to the extant literature and begin to think about next steps for what they can do to build on what they learned from that instrument, to probably both refine the instrument, but then also begin to think about what kinds of services and supports and interventions would be beneficial to their schools. In Kentucky, it'll play out differently. We're hosting a workshop where we will much more closely look at the report that we've talked about some today, that IES report on measuring student engagement in upper elementary through high school. So we'll review those 21 instruments. We'll talk about the needs of the schools and districts represented there, what they're hoping to get out of a process of better understanding student engagement among their student populations. Through that discussion and process, we will identify an instrument to be used in Kentucky, one instrument that we use across the state with all of the participating districts. We'll then spend quite a bit of the day training the participants there to administer the surveys. So we'll do kind of a survey administration 101, where we work with the stakeholders there to build their capacity with regard to data collection quality and how to collect and maintain data, best practices with regard to survey administration. So districts and or schools will leave that session with a cadre of people who are ready to administer these surveys to collect information about their students. The schools or districts will then collect the data and submit it to us at the REL. REL staff will conduct all of the analyses and prepare data memos that provide a snapshot of what student engagement looks like across whatever dimensions are being measured in the instrument that's selected. We'll prepare descriptive data, but as much and as full and as rich and as extensive a set of descriptive findings as are possible given the instrument that's selected. We'll prepare that for them, and then we'll, similar to West Virginia, host a debriefing workshop where we'll share and discuss the results, map it to the literature to identify appropriate interventions given what they learned about their own particular students. And that's key. The question I asked earlier, it looks like there are quite a few schools and districts that have discussed student engagement, and some even that have had professional learning around student engagement, but they haven't extensively measured it within their own schools and districts. And so those are good efforts, but they're often not very targeted in that sense, because as we've talked about, it's a really broad engagement is a really broad category of issues and opportunities. And so by doing this work of measuring and identifying in a precise, systematic way what student engagement looks like, both in terms of overall levels of engagement, but then variations by grade level, by class level, by school within the same district, a lot of different ways of looking at that information, we're going to have a much more precise and a much clearer picture of what the needs are. And we can take that in turn, connect it to what the literature tells us about the interventions that are effective at addressing, again, particular kinds of needs. And we'll assist those schools and districts in developing an action plan for next steps. So they'll actually leave that workshop with an action plan that says this is what we know about student engagement in our district and the needs that we've identified associated with that. This is how those needs connect to what the literature says about what's effective in responding to and intervening to address particular types of engagement issues. And then here's what we're going to do to move forward in meeting the needs of those students in those schools and districts. So I think, LaDotta, do we have time for questions now, or should we wrap up and then come back to questions?
Why don't we have about 5 minutes for questions, and then we'll have some closing remarks and give folks time to do the stakeholder feedback survey. And we do have a few questions, Jerry, and like I said, we'll take about 5 minutes for those. The first is, could you recommend a good observation protocol scale for student engagement?
There are a couple in that in the IS report. I don't have the names of them on the top of my head. Can we get emails from people, and I could actually refer them to the exact pages within the report where they can learn about a couple of different observation instruments in there. Yes, we have information from their registration. So yes, we can do that. Another question is to explain the differences in the presentation from that presented in the document. An example is SEI on screen 15 minutes to administer versus 20 to 30 minutes on page 46. To which dimension is psychological engagement connected? Can you repeat that?
Yeah, this person would like to know the difference between the presentation and the document that we provided. You know, for example, SEI on the screen is 15 minutes to administer versus 20 to 30 minutes. And then to which dimension is this engagement connected?
Okay, so the SEI, yeah, that one's a little different. There are a couple of different versions of that. And one version includes one version is only bidimensional. It measures affective and cognitive engagement. That's the shorter one. That's 30 or so items in 15 minutes. There's another version of that has been used in some of the academic studies, some of the research studies that includes that other dimension, includes the behavioral dimension. And I've reviewed both and I've used both, but I'm not sure which one is included in the report.
And Jerry, we'll be able to follow up to these questions afterwards, so we might be able to provide more clarification.
And in fact, for that person, I could send them citations to 2 different research studies that use the 2 different versions of the SEI. Okay.
That would be great. Thank you. Another question, just trying to cover as many of these as possible in this short amount of time, but again, we will refer back to the questions and answer those and provide the answers to you. Would it make sense, Jerry, to use these self-assessments as universal screeners to identify students in need of additional support?
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the most common uses of some of these instruments by school districts. While that's really valuable, it's also a great first step in the sense of developing a baseline and then continuing to monitor students to, again, as in the Gwinnett County example, be on the alert for changes in students. So it's a great way to take the temperature of where students are at any given time. That temperature can also be a great baseline for continuing to monitor.
Okay. Another question, where and when is the one-day workshop in Kentucky? And while I know we don't have that firm date just yet, I thought you might want to speak to what we're planning for the one-day workshop.
Sure. So we don't have a date or a location planned yet, but it will be a workshop involving school or district level teams. We've been working with regional cooperatives in Kentucky to identify those teams, and we're planning to in a single day. It'll be a long day with a lot of work, but to have people leave that one-day session with an instrument selected and with a core of people who are prepared to go back to their school and district and implement it. And we'll do logistical work to support that. So we'll secure from the developers or prepare an online version and paper versions of the instruments and provide them to the district. So it'll be kind of a turnkey thing for them. We'll just need their commitment to administering, to getting their students together and taking the time to collect the information.
Okay. And Jerry, there are a couple questions that are related. One is, can you describe the process in collaborating with the REL on projects? And I would say for that answer that we work through what we call alliances, which are groups of districts or schools from either within a state or cross states that are interested in a specific topic. And we are available. You have our contact information. We'll make sure that we get that out to you so that if there's a particular topic that you would like to discuss with us, that's certainly something that we can talk with you about. We can connect you to perhaps alliances that are already in place, but we can also explore other options for looking at the topic that you're interested in discussing. The other question related to that is, will REL work with folks developing their own instruments to measure student engagement like West Virginia? And I thought you might want to answer that part, Jerry.
Again, please.
Will REL, you mentioned how West Virginia created their own instrument, and this question wants to know if REL will work with people to develop their own instruments to measure student engagement.
Yeah. That's a legitimate technical assistance project that we could do. I would alert the stakeholder who asked that question that it's sort of a long process of it would need to go into the REL's annual work plan, but it's certainly in principle something that RELs do all the time. Helping people develop instruments to measure constructs of interest to them. Yes.
Okay. Well, we have several questions, and I do apologize that we cannot get to all of those, but we will answer the questions and get the answers out to all of our participants so that you have the information. Thank you for submitting questions, and like I said, just because we can't answer them right now, we certainly will get answers out to you. Just as, a way to kind of finish up this webinar, because we do want to be considerate of your time, I hope that you gained a deeper understanding about student engagement, and I think that Jerry was able to provide us with a lot of information really in a short amount of time. We will continue working on answering your questions if you have others that you'd like to send in. And something that is extremely important for us is to make sure that we receive your feedback for today's event. So we have about 7 minutes left, and we would ask that you go to the link that is on the screen, and please, while this is fresh in your mind, complete this short survey for us so that we do have information and can use that information from you to help us plan future events that would be of interest to you. So again, we appreciate your participation and ask now that you would complete the survey. And again, we'll be back to you with information on the answers to the questions that you've posted today. Jerry, do you have any final comments you'd like to make?
Thank you, everyone, for participating. And I would be more than happy to track down in any of this information things that people asked about and connect you to those resources. And it looks like I just got an email from someone already, so one of the participants. So I'm sure we'll continue to chat, and I can track some of these things down for you. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.